This is an oral history interview with Mr. Arnold Sievers in his office on December 22nd, 1982. The interviewer is Susan Gortner. Mr. Sievers, what was your father's name and where was he born?
My father's name was William Newton Sievers. He was born at Nancy, Kentucky.
And your mother?
Lida Ella Weddle was her name, and she was born at Kingstown, Kentucky.
What type of work did your father do?
My father was a doctor, a medical doctor at Whiteheath, Illinois. He located there in 1910.
Where did he go to school?
He graduated from the University of Louisville, in Louisville, Kentucky.
How much schooling was required then for a doctor?
He, undergraduate, I think he only had 1 year and 3 years of medical school.
Can you tell us a little bit about the life of a country doctor?
Well, of course, when he started with a horse and buggy. That was his mode of transportation. And the roads weren't oiled back in those days, and in the spring, mud would be almost up to the axles on the buggy as he traveled around through the countryside. And he also used, when there was snow on the ground and the ground was frozen, he also used what they called a cutter, which is a form of a one-horse sleigh. And I can recall that he had in the cutter and in the buggy, when it was cold, the buggy was enclosed with side curtains. He had a foot warmer that he burned charcoal in his feet. He sat his feet, or put his feet on the charcoal foot warmer. He had a horsehide coat and a horsehide mittens and a horsehide hat that were lined at when he went out in real bitter cold weather. He wore those. And he, of course, the horse didn't go very fast over those kind of roads, and any kind of a call at all that he had to make 3 or 4 or 5 miles out of Whiteheath, it probably took him an hour and a half to go and to come back. And he, when he died, in his effects, we found one of his first account books, and an office call at that time was 50 cents, and a house call was $1. And that would be in 1910, 1911. As the years went on, then later on, along about 1918, 1919, he bought an automobile, a Saxon automobile, which was a chain drive automobile. It was a small car with a one-seated car. And it's much like one of the smaller cars today. And but of course he still had to keep the horse because the roads were so poor that when it got real muddy he couldn't drive. Then later on in the 1920s, he went to Model T Fords. And by that time, the roads were in good enough condition that he pensioned off the horse, and the horse lived until he was 33 years old.
Oh, that's old.
That's right. And he had, of course, all kinds of experiences. There were no hospitals, there were no specialists. You had to be a sort of a jack of all trades and take care of any situation that confronted you. And if someone was injured badly enough to go to the hospital, the closest hospital was in Champaign, which, as you know, is about 18, 19 miles from east of Whiteheath, and the person was put on a sort of a litter and put on the interurban and taken to Champaign and taken to the hospital. And the killer disease back in those days was pneumonia. And we don't have it anymore, but there would also be outbreaks of smallpox. And many people had smallpox, and some died as a result of having smallpox. But he was a very busy man, and he never turned anybody down that called him. And he was out a lot at night. Many times he was gone all night long because of the fact that it took him so long to get to the person's house that was sick. The telephone was one of those wall telephones where you stood at the telephone and rang a crank, and everybody had their own independent number. It was all party line, and his number was 3 long rings and a short ring. If you heard that ring on the telephone, you knew they were calling for him.
Did everybody listen in then?
Well, I suppose there was a certain amount of that, yes. And his office was in the house, and in fact, when he built the house, 2 rooms on the west side were his offices, and they were connected by a door to the rest of the house. Somebody came to his office, he walked from, and he was out in the other part of the house. He merely walked from the house into his office. Another thing, of course, they had no prescriptions in those days as such. Now you go to the doctor and he tells you need medicine, gives you a prescription, you go to the drugstore and buy your medicine. In those days he had to keep a supply of medicine on hand, and when the man left the office he had his medicine with him. Those are my memories, and we had one man die on our front porch, and many people that were severely injured, let's put it that way. Were brought to the office. Most of them were farm accidents, of course. Back in those days, you had a lot of broken bones, sometimes severe cuts that they received in farm accidents.
I imagine it was frustrating for him.
No, I never saw the man where he was absolutely, where I could say that he was frustrated. He was so busy that he didn't have time to be frustrated. Once in a great while, he would get a patient that I suppose that, as all doctors, that he wasn't quite sure what was wrong with them, and he had a library of sorts, and I've seen him sit and read for an hour and a half, and then make up his mind as to his diagnosis and how he was going to treat the individual.
Did he have trouble? Did he often have trouble receiving his payment, or were people pretty good?
Well, in the main, the people were honest, and they tried their best to pay. And back in those days, he had the horse, and he kept 2 milk cows. He had a garden, and some paid in kind. In other words, they brought him a load of corn or a load of hay for his horses, for his animals, and he gave them credit on their doctor bill. There was a lot of that done back in those days. If you didn't have the money, you figured out some other way. He had 2 experiences that I would like to relate to you. When I was about 13 years old, a family up in the country drank out of a shallow well, and a man, his wife, and 4 children, and everyone but the man had contracted typhoid fever. And for about 3 months, he went every day to their house. I went up with him one time in his Model T, and they had a Shetland pony and a Shetland pony colt. The man followed my father out of the house and asked him if he would take the pony and give him credit for $40 on his doctor bill. And my father asked me if I'd take care of the pony, and of course I was very happy to agree to that, and that's the way I got my one and only Shetland pony. He kept the pony, and there were 3 of us in the family, my brother and my sister being younger, and we all outgrew the pony. He got too big for him. And one day the pony was tied to the clothesline and was grazing out in the side yard, and a horse buyer came by and asked my dad if he would sell the pony, and my dad told him that he would. He wanted to know what he wanted for him, and he said $40. So after 5 years, we got the use of the pony, and he finally got his $40.
Got his $40 too.
Another time, family had been ill for quite a while, and they were in dire straits, and they had a litter of pups. Dog had a litter of pups. Toy fox terriers, black and tan pups. And the man induced my father to take one of them and give him credit for $10 on his doctor bill. And that dog, until he died at the age of 13, and never left my dad's, or rarely ever left my dad's side, and rode with him every place that he went.
So that worked out well too.
Yes, he really figured that he got his $10 worth there because he was very fond of that dog.
How big of area? How far would your father go?
Well, he had, I suppose, a radius of around 12 to 15 miles.
That's a pretty good distance.
That's right. And, of course, by radius, I mean not everybody, and on the fringes of that radius doctored with him, but there were some that lived that far away that did. And but almost every town little town had a doctor. Mansfield had one, Seymour had one, DeLand had one, and Monticello at that time had 3. And almost every town of any size had a country doctor.
How big was Whiteheath then?
Whiteheath was a town of around 400 people. And at that time, Whiteheath, the railroads, both the Illinois Central and the Illinois Traction System, ran through Whiteheath, and there was about 20 or 25 people, including the station agents, that worked for the railroads. And of course, a lot of older people that had retired and came to Whiteheath. And we had a blacksmith shop, we had 2 grocery stores, a hardware store, a bank, and an elevator, and pool hall.
That's quite a bit. When did the bank close?
The bank sold out in 1928 or 29. Sold all of its assets to the Moore State Bank here in Monticello. The Moore State Bank was located where the National Bank of Monticello is located now, and was closed during the bank holiday and never reopened.
What was the name of the bank in Whiteheath?
Well, it started out as a private bank. Back in those days, if you wanted to start a bank, you petitioned the state, and if they were satisfied, they issued you a charter. And as a private bank, it was called for years S.L. Sievers and Company. Silas L. Sievers, who was my father's uncle and who induced him to settle in Whiteheath, was a prominent farmer, and he ran the bank in Whiteheath. Later on, it became the Whiteheath State Bank.
What were the names of the 2 grocery stores?
Well, the first man that I remember that ran the grocery store was a man by the name of Ed Drexler, Drexler. He lived next door to us, and In fact, we only lived about 3 houses from the grocery store. And then he sold a man by the name of Max Branch, and Max Branch later sold to Hugh Hanna. And Hugh Hanna retired, and Ross Mitchell took it over. And the last one to succeed Ross Mitchell was, in that particular grocery store, was a fellow by the name of Fred Murphy. Now, all of those people are dead now.
When did the grocery stores close in Whiteheath?
Grocery store closed in Whiteheath about 15 years ago. The chain stores in the proximity of Monticello and Champaign, and people traveling in their automobiles, it got to the point where they just couldn't buy in enough volume to be competitive, and as a result, they didn't have, their business dropped where it wasn't profitable anymore.
Do you recall families being quarantined?
Oh, yes.
Were you ever quarantined?
Yes. Quarantined for, in fact, I was in the house with my brother and sister in quarantine for whooping cough and never did get it. They were in the house with me in quarantine for, I had smallpox. They were quarantined for, I was quarantined for smallpox, so they never did get it. But we all had the mumps and the measles, and we never had scarlet fever, but the usual childhood diseases.
When you were quarantined, what did your father do? Since he had to...
Well, he of course, was allowed in and out for some reason. I can't explain to you the logic of that, but he wasn't quarantined.
So he could...
But people could not come and visit us, nor could we go out and play with other children and or visit anyone's house. We were quarantined to the house. Let's put it that way. And I can remember the Board of Health put a sign on your door and said that you had whatever you had, smallpox or measles or what it had. I mean, that was a warning to people that might want to come in. It gave warning not to go in, that you were quarantined for smallpox. Then certain diseases, and I can't remember now which one, when you were released from the quarantine, and they fumigated the house with formaldehyde.
Oh, really?
Right.
Who did that?
Well, you
had to do it yourself.
You had to do it yourself. That's right. But, they thought that I suppose that'd kill the germs.
Do you recall what diseases those are for?
No, I can't. I can't tell you right now.
What hospital did they send people to in Champaign?
Burnham. At that time, there was no Carl Hospital. There wasn't, and Mercy Hospital wasn't very large, but Burnham was the hospital in Champaign at that time.
How long did your mother attend school?
My mother went to through 12 grades and then went 2 years to a teacher's college at Berea, Kentucky.
Did she teach then?
Yes, she taught for about a year. In fact, my father was 4 years older than my mother, and before he started the medical school, her last year of school, he was her teacher.
Oh, really?
Right.
Is that how they met?
Yes. And they were married in 1910. When he first came to Whiteheath, he boarded and had his office in the home of John and Laurie Dilsaver. And their son, Jewel Dilsaver, who is in his 80s now, is still alive and lives in Mattoon, Illinois, and was a very prominent lawyer, having been state's attorney down there. He is retired now, and his law firm was Dilsaver, and I think the other gentleman's name is Geiger. But another thing I should probably mention, and my father died on December the 20th, 1960, And about a year prior to his death, the people in Whiteheath I don't know exactly the word I want to use, but anyhow, it was quite an occasion. They had it in the school gymnasium. I don't know that they celebrated his 50 years as a doctor. He did get his 50-year pen, of course. He died in 1960 prior to his death, which was good. And there must have been 100 or 150 people there, and 3 of the ladies in the community searched the records here in the courthouse, and they determined that he had delivered over 1,600 babies in Piatt County, Illinois. And one of the proudest things that he was most proud of was the fact that he never lost a mother in childbirth. Some of the infants died, but never a mother. And of course, there were more children than that because he practiced in the western edge of Champaign County, and they didn't, of course, search the Champaign County records.
That's a good record, though.
Yes, especially in those days when with what they had to work with. Another thing I think I'd like to tell you is the fact that I went to school with. At those days, you had several people that you went to school with whose fathers were what they call farm laborers, hired men. And at that time, the families were given a house and a hog to butcher and maybe a half a beef, and of course they had all the garden space they wanted. And some of those families raised 4 or 5 children with those fringe benefits, and the father making about $40 a month. I can remember when a baby was born, the charge my dad made was $25.
That's gone up considerably.
That's right.
What's the ancestral origin of your last name?
It's German.
German.
My mother's people were English, but my father would be my great-grandfather came over here from Germany right after the Civil War and settled in Kentucky.
Who was the first one and then in your family to come to Piatt County?
Silas Sievers, the gentleman I spoke about earlier on that had the bank. And he came up here back in those days. All of your corn was harvested by hand. And Silas Sievers came up here, and he started out as a farmhand, and he didn't have much education, but he was very good at judging the weight of cattle and hogs, and he started out buying livestock. He accumulated some land, and then he accumulated more, and at one time he had about 700 acres about 2 miles east of Whiteheath. Then he farmed that as a unit. They had a very large house, and in corn shucking times, people that knew the name from Kentucky would come out here and work for him and stay there at his house. And he had, of course, furnish them with room and board. They got 2 or 3 cents a bushel for every bushel of corn that they shucked. Then when they got the corn all in, they went back to Kentucky. And it was very interesting. I can remember as a child going out there, and there would be 20, 25 men. She had a long dining room table and then benches along the side of it. Those men sat, and his wife, cooked and fed them all. And it was quite an operation. He must have had 30, 40 horses that they worked. But he had, I can recall too, that he had a Cadillac automobile, one of the first Cadillacs, the first time I ever heard the word of a Cadillac automobile. He had one. And he was quite a wheeler and dealer in his day, but he later on lost everything he had.
What was the first automobile you recall seeing?
Well, I'm not real sure. The first one I remember is that Saxon, but I might, and I suppose I was about 5 or 6 years old. But I'm sure that there are other people who had cars before that.
What about airplanes?
No, I don't recall airplanes until in the 20s. We had. I remember the first time I ever thought that they would be feasible was when Ford made the tri-motor plane. I believe that was along in the early 30s. That was your first transport. You had those small planes like Lindbergh flew the mail in, and prior to that. But I don't think flying became much of a deal until in the middle 20s.
And that you didn't see very many airplanes
No,
in Pike County?
I don't think anybody in Pine County owns one.
Yeah. Did anybody ever live with your family besides your brothers and sisters when you were growing up?
No, we had always had a lady that helped my mother. My mother had to take care of my father's books, and when he was out on calls, had to take care of the telephone. And the lady came and did the washing and helped her sometimes. But as far as anybody living with us, no, they weren't. Excepting it in the flu epidemic in I believe it was 1918. I don't recall too much about that, but they had found some lady that came and stayed with us because everybody had the flu but my father.
He was lucky because he had to be out treating people.
Right.
And I imagine that there were several deaths due to that.
Oh yes, several people died of influenza. And as I said, pneumonia. Mm-hmm. That was before penicillin and sulfa drugs. And now you rarely hear of anybody dying of pneumonia. But prior to the, I guess they came into vote along about World War II, and prior to that time, several people died of both pneumonia and the flu.
What games did you play in your childhood?
We played baseball every time we could. We played out in the middle of the street. The neighborhood kids would get together and play baseball. And the grade school that we went to, they had an outdoor basketball court. And when you got in the I believe it was in the 6th grade, then the Whiteheath played D-Land and Cisco and Monticello and Mansfield and basketball, but they had to take and line the court and then put the foul lines in every time. And then late in the afternoon after school, we'd either go to Cisco or D-Land or Mansfield, or they'd come to Whiteheath and the kids would play basketball.
And you said it was outdoor basketball?
Outdoor. There was no gymnasium.
How would you go between schools?
Most usually your parents would take you. Mm-hmm. And while we're talking about old times, I started the high school. There was no high school in Whiteheath. It used to be a 10 grade school up there, and then the children would come to Monticello and graduate for 2 years and graduate. And then they cut it down to 8 years, and you went all 4 years down here. When I started the school down here in 1926, we came by automobile, Ford automobile, highway between here and Whiteheath. Of course, the old road was put in 1923, and I rode with these other boys. There was 5 of us, and we paid the owner of the automobile $1 a week to ride with him. But of course, at that time, he was buying gasoline for about 20 cents a gallon, and we rode both ways with him. And you asked me to answer your question. Our folks took us in automobiles.
Uh-huh.
The high school, when I was in high school and played football and basketball, they had no school buses. And the parents of the people that participated in the games hauled them in their automobiles. The families provided the transportation for their own children to ride to and from the games.
I wondered if you ever rode the interurban to the games.
No, mainly because it wasn't convenient to go to, there would be no interurban, for instance, to a lot of these places where we played. So it was mostly a deal where you had to depend on your folks to take you.
So you went to school, all your grade school in White Heath?
In White Heath. I went 8 years up there, and then I came down here, and I graduated from high school in the spring of 1930.
How big a school was White Heath when you were going there?
Well, it's much larger now than it was then. But because they're Sangamon Township right now, that school in White Heath has more, for the area, the school building has more students than Monticello, because Sangamon Township has so many, not suburbs of White Heath, but settlements out in there where there's 15, 20, 30 houses out along the river. People have bought those wooded lots and built and live out there. But I couldn't answer your question. I would suppose that you had 50, 60 children.
How many classrooms were there?
2. You had the first 4 grades had a teacher for the first 4 grades and a teacher for the upper 4 grades. Usually the one that taught the upper grades was a man, and the one that taught the smaller children was a woman.
Did you come home for lunch, or did you?
Oh yes, they had no school lunches. You had to come home from lunch or take it. Now, when I came to high school, I brought my own lunch with me, or they'd give you a quarter or 30 cents, and you could come uptown and buy yourself a hot dog for a nickel, a hamburger for a dime, and a milkshake for a dime.
Where would you buy your lunch?
Over on the east side of the square, where the optometrist is now, there was a place called the Bill and Pete's Candy Kitchen, and they had chili and hot dogs and candy and hamburgers. It was mostly a sandwich shop, and then they had a soda fountain.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'll never forget, and I don't know whether anybody that you've interviewed before has mentioned this or not, but it went to her death with her. Years ago, down there where Bill Hayes's TV shop is now, across there from the schoolyard, was a lady ran a little restaurant, and the man ran a filling station on it. Their name was Erdley, Erdley. And for 15 cents, you could buy the most succulent barbecues that anybody ever ate. But she never would divulge her recipe to anyone. And they were great big buns, and then the barbecue meat was in there, and then there was sliced cabbage on top of that, and the kids were crazy over those barbecues. But
she never told.
She never would tell anybody just exactly what ingredients she put in that meat.
How long was that there?
I can't tell you exactly when they left there. I remember that it was gone. The building that's down there now was built by Cliff Nelson and Les Mackey, who started a grocery store there. they added to the building that was there. But whether the earth, it seems to me that, well, I beg your pardon. They increased the size of it. Prior to that time, a fellow by the name of Merle Myers, whose daughter was in high school with me and who now lives, I think, in Colorado Springs, ran a grocery store there. So I would say that they probably left, Early's left there around 1936, 1937.
After you got out of high school, what did you do?
I went to the University of Alabama, and I went to the University of Illinois as a freshman, and then I went to the University of Alabama, and 1 year in pre-legal down there, and 3 years in law school.
Mm-hmm. Then you came back to Monticello?
Came back here and was admitted to the bar in 1935.
So you were kind of in the middle of the Depression then?
Yes.
How did the Depression affect your life?
Well, it had a profound effect on it. Our house bill down there, again, we're going back to different times for room and board and fraternity dues, was $56 a month. My father sent me a check in February. The bank's closed in March. I had happened to have a little money and didn't cash my check, and I was carrying my check around with me. And when I deposited, the banks were closed, and it was on the Moore Bank, and the Moore Bank never did open. Mm-hmm. So my father had to borrow money on an insurance policy, a life insurance policy, in order that I could continue to go to school. There was no money to be borrowed anywhere, but the life insurance companies, if you had a policy and had cash surrender value, would loan you some money on your life insurance, and he happened to have me in that position. But if it hadn't been for that life insurance policy, I'd have had to come home.
Did your father ever get his money back? Did he lose
in the
money?
Moore Bank, I think they paid 81 or 82% of the deposit. Now, the other bank was closed too, and it never did reopen. And they paid 100 cents on the First National Bank of Monticello, 100 cents on the dollar, and paid interest to their depositors.
How did people feel about the banks closing?
Well, of course, they were. They didn't know what to think. I mean, you always felt that my money's in the bank, my money's safe, and I've got money in the bank, and I'm doing well. And all at once, the bank closed, and you didn't have any money. You just couldn't touch your money in the bank. No way to get to it. At one time, of course, farmers lost their farms, and there were a lot of bankruptcies, and corn was selling for about 14 cents a bushel, hogs selling for about 5 cents a pound. And I don't want this to sound like a political propaganda, but when Roosevelt came in and the farm program came in, and then after 3 or 4 or 5 years, why, things started getting a lot better for them. And a lot of people that walked in and were able to make a down payment on something, raise a down payment some way and buy land. I mean, they paid off on a farm in 4 or 5 years and owned it. They didn't owe anybody anything on it. They bought them very cheaply. In fact, the insurance companies, right after the Depression, owned more land in this county than anybody else. And they just begged the people to take it off their hands. I mean, for what they had in them, they gave you very liberal terms and very liberal interest rates because they didn't want to operate the land. They were trying to get the money back out of it. And they were a lot of foreclosures and a lot of people that saw that they were up against it. They didn't bother to have them foreclosed. They just, with the agreement with the insurance company, just deeded it to them. And they said, we can't pay you, here's the land, we'll give it to you.
So if you had any money later, you could do pretty well.
That's right, and or if you had a job that paid you, and that's always true in the Depression. If you have a job that, if you're a teacher or a preacher, or, where you get a paycheck, and you know you're going to get that paycheck, those were the people that were the best off in the Depression. People that had to work for themselves, they were in the worst trouble. But the people back in those days, they buckled into it, and in the main way, they all made do, so one way or another. And there was no relief. I mean, the government didn't help you. The state didn't help you. There was no food stamps. You had to do it yourself. You had to figure out how you were going to do it. And they did it. I don't know if another one like that came along, what would happen. I suppose it'd be open rebellion in the streets.
Did your parents pay for all your schooling?
Yes, they did.
What was your first job as an adult? Or
My,
did you work
my first job, and many of us worked for W.A. Doss after we came out of school. Mr. Doss had a practice. A lot of collection work, and of course you can imagine that in the Depression there was a lot of that. A lot of people owed other people, and either couldn't or wouldn't pay them. And of the attorneys in Monticello, and I may leave out one or two, but I don't mean to. N.E. Hudson started with him. C.E. Corbett started with him. Carl Glasgow worked with him, or for him. Birch Morgan worked for him, and I worked for him. Not all at the same time, but we got our starts with Mr. Doss.
Did you have any job while you were in high school or growing up?
In the summertime, I worked on a farm for various farmers for $2 a day.
What would you do with your earnings?
Those were mine. They let me keep my earnings, and I suppose, like all kids, I squandered.
After you came back and were working for Mr. Doss, when did you meet your wife?
I met my wife in Shreveport, Louisiana, when I was in service in World War II. I was stationed at Barksdale Field, and I had a close friend that I'd gone to high school with who wasn't in the service because he was in an important defense job in Shreveport, and they introduced me to my wife. And we were married in 1944, and we came back here. I came back here then, and we got out of service in 1946.
Where did you serve?
In India, with the Air Transport Command.
How long were you in there?
I was in India I arrived in India in the fall of 1944 and left there in February of 1946.
What was your job over there?
I was with the Judge Advocate General's Department, and of course is the legal department of the Air Force, or the whole Army for that matter. And of course you process claims, and we had court-martial work to do, and it just pretty much the Air Force's lawyer for that particular station.
So when, after the war was over, then you and your wife came back?
We came back and lived for a while at Whitey's with my folks, and then later rented an apartment down here just south of the Mackey Funeral Home. That at that time Paul Gooker owned it, and Dwight Mackey owns it now. It's right next to the funeral home. It was a small apartment. They had a bedroom. All rooms were small: a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen. son was born, and we built our house where we live now in 1950. Moved in on Labor Day in 1950.
What was your wife's name?
Martha Jane Gibson.
When did you set up your own practice then?
Well, after Mr. Doss was disbarred in 1938, I worked for a lawyer by the name of Charlie Furkey. When I said in 38, it was 37. Went to work for Charlie Furkey. Mr. Furkey then died suddenly as a result of a goiter operation in May of 1938. And E.J. Hallbecker came to me and wanted to know if I would go into partnership with him, and then we formed that partnership. And Mr. Hallbecker and I were partners until he died in 1952. And then I was on my own.
Why was Mr. Doss disbarred?
Well, it's a long story, and I just rather not comment about it. I mean, I could go on for a week. I think some of the charges against him were probably true, and some of them weren't. But yeah, mainly it was for overreaching. But then I'm talking about things that he did that weren't quite ethical.
What organizations and churches have you belonged to in Monticello?
I don't belong to any church. Of course, the American Legion. I've been the commander of the American Legion post, and also county commander of the American Legion. Belong to the Moose. Belong to the Masonic Order. And that's it.
What president do you recall most vividly?
Well, the one I guess I recall most vividly was FDR, because he brought the country out of this tailspin. I mean, everybody, when he was elected, he was their hope, and of course things did get a lot better as time went on. But my favorite president is Harry Truman.
Why is that?
Well, I think that Harry Truman made all of the right moves on the big matters. He made a few mistakes on the little one, and Harry Truman was a very creditable man. You always knew where he stood. Anytime he said that it's going to be this way, it would be that way. I mean, he didn't cut and fill or like a lot of these other fellas had done. And another thing is he was loyal to his friends. I maybe look at the thing wrong, but I admire him for the Pendergast thing. Pendergast, of course, was a crooked politician, or at least alleged to be, in Kansas City, but Harry Truman had come up through that machine. And when Pendergast died, it wasn't the popular thing to do because he'd already been convicted to go to his funeral, but Harry Truman went. And he was very loyal to his friends. And I think was that he didn't let he played politics, sure, but at the same time, I think most of his, when he decided to do something, is what's best for the country. Mm-hmm. They don't always do that. They sometimes do the political thing.
As a lawyer, and you look back on your career, what were some of your interesting cases?
Well, the one I'll never forget was a murder case that the People versus Julius L. Girth, G-E-R-T-H. Julius L. Girth, we had our offices over there above where the Gamble store is now. And he was sent in here right at the start of sort of an unemployment compensation deal. He'd been a Marine and captain of the Marines in World War II. And he was head of that office. And this girl came up there to get her unemployment compensation, and eventually he and she got married. So I came downtown one morning, and I hadn't seen him for about 2 or 3 months. The sheriff called me up and said, Mr. Gerst down there in jail wants to talk to you. So I went down, and he told me what had happened. They'd had a lot of, they'd transferred him to Peoria, and she, of course, went with him. But they had a lot of trouble, and she came home to her mother. And there was a little grocery store up there now where you'll have to help me.
Dr. Munch?
Munt, where Dr. Munt's office is. And she and her mother were walking up there, and he drove up behind her, and he's behind them in his car, and he jumped out and grabbed her. And she broke loose and started to run, and he had a gun on him, and he shot her twice and killed her. He got in the car and drove down here, and it was in May. And the sheriff and his wife were sitting in chairs out there in front of the jail.
Who was the sheriff?
I'm not sure whether it was Bill Bennett or Paul Smith, one or the other of them. I believe. And he handed him the gun. He said, I just shot my wife. Within 5 minutes after he shot her, he was in the jail. Well, of course, he had no defense as far as to whether or not he did it. He'd already admitted that he did it. And there had been people that saw him shoot her, including her mother. So he was a very erratic sort of a character, and his father had been a retired streetcar motorman in Bloomington. So he told me, he said, you go see my father and see if he was an only child, and see if he'll finance my defense. So I went up there and I told him what had happened to him, and of course they were all broken up. But the father said, anything that it takes, if it takes everything I have. So we conceived the idea of pleading him not guilty by reason of insanity. And we selected we finally got down to it. Carl Glasgow was the state's attorney. And we made an agreement with Carl that the county would pick a psychiatrist. We would pick one and pay our own. They'd pay theirs. And the two of them would pick a third. And the county would pay for the third. And however if they decided he was sane, we would not raise the insanity. We'd just plead him guilty and throw him on the mercy court. And of course he agreed to that. Girth agreed to that. They came down here and found him guilty by reason of insanity. Or they didn't find him guilty. They said that he was insane at the time he did it. And he did. They had a lot of medical records and one thing and another that in his Army files that sort of substantiated what they found. But it was a sort of a miscarriage of justice. He went down to Chester, the hospital for criminally insane. He hadn't been down there over a month until they had him working in the office. And about 1.5 years after that, the American Legion took a hold of the thing. And they hired a lawyer for him. They filed a petition down there. He recovered his insanity and turned him loose. Next time I heard anything about him was I picked up the Tribune one morning. He'd married again. This is 4 or 5 years after that. Mm-hmm. He'd married again in Chicago, and the woman had divorced him, and she got custody of the child. He kidnapped the child and taken it to California, baby. I don't know where. That's the last I ever heard of him. I don't know where he is or what he's doing or whether he's alive or dead. Probably dead. This was before I went into service in 41.
Do you have any other cases that particularly stand out?
Well, the will contest case years ago, I will never forget. The question came up as to whether it was on a question of whether the will was forged or not. This lady lived in Indiana. At that time, if you had no children, then you were married. Your personal property went to your husband. But your real estate, only half of it went to the husband, half of it went back to your own family. Your brothers and your sisters, your mother and your father. This lady had 280 acres, I believe it was, up here in Blue Ridge Township, which she lived in Lebanon, Indiana. When she died, her will was typed. Her name was not signed on the bottom. It said I, and then her signature, Evangeline Hunter. Being of sound mind and so forth. Leave everything I own to my husband, Ben. At the bottom of it, there was two signatures. One was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and the other one was an officer in the Navy. Well, the contention, her sister, they had no children. And the question came up, of course, as to where that land was going to go. If the will was good, the husband would get it all. If it wasn't, her only living sister would take half, and he'd take half. So they maintained, the plaintiffs, that what happened was that after she died, they cut the flyleaf out of a book. She had signed her name in the front of her book on the flyleaf and typed her will around it. And that they got these two fellas then to go into cahoots with them. And we lost the case here in this court, but it was reversed in the upper court. And we had a bunch of handwriting experts in here to testify as to the age of the paper and whether that was her signature or not. It was pretty well established that it was her signature after they all agreed on that. The question came as to when this will was made, before she died or after she died. Those two, I suppose, would be
those would be interesting cases. Do you recall where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Yes, I was in Whiteheath. It was on a Sunday, and I was counting on listening to the Bears play football on the radio when they broke in.
How did people react?
Oh, I don't think at the time it quite sunk in just what we were into. And you knew it was serious, but you just didn't get too excited about it. And of course, later on, then when they started drafting people and started taking them from Pike County, then you fully realized that our Navy had been practically destroyed at Pearl Harbor, and you got concerned. There was one thing about Roosevelt. It seemed like as he could sell the people about any time he decided to on some kind of a deal. I mean, in the Depression, after he made the one speech, people perked up. Then, of course, after his famous infamy speech, everybody was determined. He made it sound like, and whether, of course, you can read whether or not, a lot of people will say that they knew in Washington long days before Pearl Harbor that was going to happen. But I don't know whether they did or they didn't. But I mean, he had everybody aroused. Their patriotism was at an all-time high.
Well, I thank you very much.
You're very welcome.